Living longer, living healthier, living better than ever before. Welcome to Mountain Pacific's Healthy Living for Life, a weekly series that gives you the information, education, and expert insight you need to become an active participant in today's ever-changing healthcare climate. Here now is today's program host.
Lou Gehrig was at the peak of his athletic career when it started to develop. Fans thought he was just in a slump, but the reality was that amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS, was robbing his body of its abilities. And just a few years after his record-breaking streak with the New York Yankees, Gehrig died at the age of 37. Today, we will talk about ALS, commonly known as Lou Gehrig's disease. Welcome to Healthy Living for Life, a show dedicated to helping you do just that. I'm Beth Brown, your host. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Joining us this morning is Paul Tuss. Paul's wife, Pam Hillary, had ALS before she passed away in 2016. Paul's mother also had ALS. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having
and for
me.
sharing your story.
You bet.
Can you just tell us a little bit about your wife, Pam?
Sure. Pam and I actually met at the University of Montana as students. She was a graduate student. I was an undergraduate student. Pam's from back east. She comes from a very large family. She's the youngest of 7 children in her family. And she got her undergraduate degree at William & Mary and then came out to the University of Montana to study environmental studies. And so we met there, and as they say, the rest is history. We were married for 27 years, have 2 children. In fact, my daughter graduates this month from Havre High School, and she was diagnosed with ALS in 2013.
Okay. And were there some indications, or how did you first know something was wrong? Were there some signs that you picked up on that you knew she might have ALS?
There were some signs. She was actually in a yoga class, and she discovered that that was becoming more and more difficult for her to participate in. And then actually we were down here in the winter of 2013 celebrating Governor Bullock's election, and we went to the inaugural ball. And the next day, we were with some friends here in Helena, and we were walking around the Capitol and just taking an early morning walk, and we were teasing her that perhaps she danced a little too hard the night before, because she was having difficulties keeping up with us. And the ALS started in her right leg. Okay. And it progressed, and pretty soon she started to drag her right leg, and so we knew that something more serious was wrong with her.
And so is that when you went to the doctor, or what point did you seek out some medical help?
Yeah, it was. I mean, obviously, when people first have ALS, they don't think they have ALS, right?
Sure.
They think that there's some other problem. And so after a period of time when we realized it wasn't getting better on its own, we did doctor here in Montana, and we doctored in Havre and then in Great Falls. And then finally, it was just so mysterious about what this problem could be. The doctors recommended to our family that we actually go to the Mayo Clinic. And so we traveled in July of 2013 to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, in Minnesota. And she was diagnosed with ALS at the Mayo Clinic on July 31st of 2013.
Can you talk a little bit about that process with having to see multiple doctors? What were they trying to figure out at that point?
There's no test for ALS. There's no one test, and so in some ways it's the last disease standing, right? You test for Lyme disease, you test to see if the individual has had a stroke. There's a lot of other things that you rule out, and so once all those other difficulties or diseases are ruled out, ALS really was the diagnosis.
And so when you got that diagnosis, what were your initial thoughts? What did you and Pam do?
We had some inkling that it may have been ALS, primarily because, as you mentioned earlier, my mother passed away from ALS in 2002. So we knew a little bit about the disease, but the disease is so rare. Mm-hmm. They say that 2 or 3 people out of 100,000 people get it, and so the thought that it visited my family twice is almost inconceivable. So we didn't think it was ALS, and then when we started thinking a little bit more about it, we realized, well, maybe it was.
So in Pam's case, then, how did the disease progress?
The disease progressed. Her right leg. She had what's called lumbar ALS instead of bulbar ALS, and so it started in her extremities, and she had difficulty walking. She used a cane to begin with, and that progressed to a scooter, and that progressed to a motorized wheelchair. So her mobility was compromised in a very significant way throughout the progression of the disease.
You mentioned in an interview a few years back that though this disease is awful, and it was awful to watch Pam have ALS, it was also a long goodbye that you two took advantage of, and you did things that maybe you wouldn't have done otherwise. Can you talk a little bit about how do you keep that sort of optimism and strength with a diagnosis like this?
Well, it gave us 3 years to really put our affairs in order. It gave us 3 years to say goodbye to one another. After 25 plus years of being married, it was wonderful. As awful as the disease is, it was wonderful to be able to do those things that were kind of on the bucket list. From going to concerts, to traveling to a family reunion in Boston. One of the original things when Pam was first diagnosed, one of the first things she said is, "I'm never going to be able to see the Chinese Wall." She was referring to, of course, the Chinese Wall in the Bob Marshall Wilderness, which we had always had on our bucket list, our personal bucket list, to go see. So actually we had made arrangements with a private pilot to fly us over the Bob Marshall Wilderness and over the Chinese Wall, knowing that she'd never be able to actually walk in and see it herself. So we did, as so many families that are diagnosed with ALS, the best that we could do to keep our family intact and to really love each other unconditionally and do whatever we could to maximize the time that we had together.
That is awesome. And we mentioned that your mom had it too. Were those two experiences similar?
No. My mother, of course, was much older than Pam when she was diagnosed. She passed away when she was 76. And her ALS, she was never in a wheelchair. In fact, she was walking the night before she passed away.
Oh.
She had bulbar ALS that affected her breathing more than her walking.
Okay.
So it was a little different. And from diagnosis to her death, it was only about 6 months. Whereas with Pam's, it was over 3 years.
Wow. Okay. So definitely different. And ALS, as you said, is rare. But what would you have our viewers know about ALS with your two experiences? What would you say?
I would say that ALS, certainly for our family, as difficult as it was, as I mentioned before, was a wonderful opportunity for us to focus on our family, do those things that we never did before. And also the other thing is we need to find a cure for ALS. And Pam was a strong advocate, even after she was diagnosed with ALS, for getting the proper funding to find a cure for this from Congress. In fact, she traveled in her wheelchair back to Washington, D.C. to lobby Congress for additional funding for research to find a cure for ALS. In my opinion, it's not a matter of if we're going to find a cure for ALS, it's when. And so we really need to put pressure on our federal legislators and others to do that sooner rather than later.
Okay, Paul, thank you very much for that message and for telling your story. We need to take a break, but coming up next, what exactly is ALS? And when and how do people get the disease? We'll be right back after a short commercial break. Stay with us. Welcome back. I'd like to introduce our next guest, Dr. Nicole Clark, a specialist in neurology from St. Peter's Health. Thanks for being here, Dr. Clark.
Thank you for having me.
So before we jump back into talking about ALS, can we just start by talking about your specialty is neurology? What exactly is that?
Sure. So neurology focuses on diseases of the brain, the spinal cord, nerves, and muscles.
Okay.
It covers everything from neuropathy to strokes, ALS, Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, all involved.
That's a lot. And so what kind of training do you have to go through to make sure you understand all those different symptoms? What does a neurologist do for education?
So we do a lot. I always tell my pre-med students, when you graduate from high school, it's like starting kindergarten again. You do 4 years of a pre-medical education, a BS degree, and then you do your medical school for 4 years, then typically a year of internship, 3 years of neurology residency, and then many of us do an additional specialty year. For instance, I did mine an extra year of fellowship in neuromuscular diseases and things like ALS.
Okay. And those systems in our body, the muscle systems and spinal cord and nerves, those are fairly complicated, right? Can you talk a little bit about how difficult it is to even talk about that from a medical standpoint?
Sure. It does get very complicated. There are a lot of diseases that we still don't fully understand in neurology. There are diseases that we don't know why they happen. ALS is an excellent example. We don't know many of the triggers that cause people to have ALS. We don't know why people have Parkinson's disease. We don't know some of the triggers for multiple sclerosis. And we're also somewhat limited in our treatment of these conditions. So that makes it especially difficult. So it's complex, there's a lot going on in the brain and the nervous system, and the treatments are very complex as well. But it also makes it very interesting.
Okay. So you talked about that we don't know a lot about ALS, but what do we know? What is it exactly?
So ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, commonly known as Lou Gehrig's, as you've talked about, that is a disease of motor neurons. And motor neurons are connected from your brain down to your spinal cord, and then from your spinal cord to your muscles. And they send these signals from your brain down to muscles. What happens in ALS is those nerves deteriorate. And when the nerves deteriorate, they stop sending the signals down to muscle. That causes the muscles to not function correctly and to atrophy or shrink.
Okay, and so you mentioned the motor neuron. That's a category of diseases, is that right? Or what are motor neuron diseases?
So motor neuron diseases are anything that affects those motor nerves. There are several others. They're less common even than ALS, but they're in the same category.
Okay, what are some examples? Are there anything we would have heard of maybe?
Probably not.
Okay.
Primary lateral sclerosis, and there are a couple other related genetic diseases that are similar.
Okay, so let's go back to ALS. We heard a little bit from Paul about some early symptoms, but typically what are the early symptoms of ALS?
The most common things that I see when people come into the clinic and have questions are when they have, for me, what I see are jumpy reflexes. So when I pull out my reflex hammer and I'm tapping on their arms or their knees, their arms and legs jump more than they should. There are also some other reflexes we look for. What they see is more the weakness. So the muscles get weak. The muscles may also shrink or atrophy. Also, they can see things called fasciculations. And fasciculations are twitching in the muscles. So people may come in and they'll say that they see their arm and it looks like there are worms underneath, kind of a twirling under the skin. And those are fasciculations.
Okay. And so we know that there isn't really a test for ALS. So how does a person know if that's what they have?
Sometimes it can be very difficult. The best way to diagnose it is the clinical symptoms. So we look at things with an examination. So I mentioned the reflexes. We look at these muscle movements if they're present. We test strength. We know ALS is a regional loss that people will lose in one section of their body first. So the pattern helps us. Also, there's a test called electromyography. And that helps us a lot to narrow down and rule out some other conditions that can look similar. But sometimes, even with that test, we have to wait and see how the disease changes and see how it progresses before we can be sure we know what the condition is.
Okay. And you mentioned earlier that we don't really know what causes ALS, but are we looking into possible causes that we might know?
We absolutely are looking into it. There is a lot of research going on right now looking at not just the causes of ALS, but how can we stop it? How can we slow things down? And are there any ways that we can prevent it from happening in the first place?
Is family history a factor that might contribute to somebody getting ALS?
There are a few people who have genetic ALS. About 10% of people with ALS have inherited it from family members. But most people, 90%, it's not inherited.
Okay. All right, well, we're going to pause there for just a few minutes to take a quick break, but we're going to continue this conversation with Dr. Clark right after these messages. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're continuing our discussion about ALS with Dr. Nicole Clark, a neurologist from St. Peter's Health, so thank you for sticking around. So Dr. Clark, how common is ALS?
So ALS affects about 6,000 people in the U.S. every year that they're diagnosed. That means that there are about 20,000 Americans living with ALS at any time, and about 150,000 worldwide.
When someone is diagnosed with ALS, how much time do they tend to have? What's the life expectancy there?
It varies greatly. The average in what we read in textbooks is an average of 3 to 5 years after getting the diagnosis or after those symptoms have become apparent. But even 10% of people live up to 10 years, 20% of people live more than 5 years. So there aren't any definitive numbers.
Okay. And we talked a little bit too about that there's no cure for ALS, but what are some of the treatments that people with ALS can get?
Sure. Well, we actually have 2 medications now that we use. So from a medical standpoint, that's pretty exciting. Edaravone was just released last summer, and it actually slows the progression of symptoms and slows the functional decline in the ability to do things. So that's very exciting medication for us. Also, there's Riluzole that has been around for several years that helps people live longer. So from a medication standpoint, there is no cure and there's nothing that stops the progression, but we can slow it down some now. There are lots of other treatments that we talk about in clinic. First, it's talking about how do you treat their problems breathing? How do you treat problems swallowing? And there are lots of things we can do to alleviate the symptoms and help people function better with their disease.
Okay. And we talked a little bit about the research being done. Can you expound upon that a little bit? What are we looking into when it comes to ALS?
Mm-hmm. So in research, we're looking at a lot of genetics, and so ways that it's passed down. Are there triggers that we can find? We're also looking for better ways to diagnose it. We talked about how difficult it is to confirm a diagnosis, and we look for biomarkers, which are things that we can test in your blood or in your spinal fluid. And then, of course, we're also doing lots of tests for treatment. There are lots of stem cell therapy tests going on right now around the country, and different medications that may slow down the disease.
Okay, so you mentioned triggers, and we talked a little bit before the break about family history maybe being one. Mm-hmm. Is age also a factor?
There is a common age. Typically people are between 40 and 70 when they're diagnosed. It's rare to be diagnosed earlier or later than that. Can happen. Certainly Caucasian descent are more likely than other ethnic or racial groups.
Okay.
And also we find some environmental factors. Actually, people in the military are almost twice as likely to develop ALS as non-military.
And that was actually going to be my next question, the environmental factors. What are some of those?
Sure. Well, we look at military service as a factor, certainly. And otherwise, that's the main one.
Oh, okay. And aren't athletes also, I know this disease is named after Lou Gehrig, who was an athlete. Are they more susceptible to ALS than other folks?
There's some question. It's not as well defined, though, as the military part.
Okay. Is ALS contagious?
No, it's not.
Okay.
It's not. If you have a loved one or a friend with ALS, you cannot catch it. There are 10% of people that have the form of ALS that is genetic and can be passed down to their children in their genes, but it's not contagious from person to person.
Okay. We talked a little bit earlier too about some of the different treatments. Are there clinics or specific facilities that people with ALS go to for their treatments?
Excellent question. Yes, there are. There are ALS clinics. They tend to be at university settings. For instance, the one I trained at University of Utah is a multidisciplinary clinic. And that can be really nice because it's people, not just neuromuscular experts, but people who focus on just treating ALS as a subset of the disease. And they bring in physical, occupational, speech therapy, respiratory therapy, all into one clinic to see everyone in that same day.
And nutrition, isn't that also something that someone with ALS has to think about? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Nutrition is a very important part. We know that being aggressive and making sure that people with ALS have enough nutrition, even if it's requiring a feeding tube, is really important and helps prolong their ability to do things and keeps their strength.
Okay, great. Earlier in the show, we talked with Paul Tess, whose wife and mother both had ALS, and he talked a little bit about how they were able to cope with having the disease. From a medical perspective, do you have any advice to close us out here of what you would say to help folks who have been diagnosed cope with that?
Sure. What I would say is the most important advice you have is to prepare. And you can prepare, even with such a devastating diagnosis. You can prepare financially, you can prepare emotionally, and you can prepare your plans to take control over what you want to have done to you. Talk to your doctor, talk to your family about whether you want assistance breathing, whether you want assistance with a feeding tube, and be open with those decisions.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise.
Thank you for having me.
And for being with us today. And I would like to thank Paul Tess for sharing his story and joining us this morning as well. And thank you for joining us. We hope to see you again next week. In the meantime, stay fit, stay well, and stay healthy for life with Healthy Living for Life. Have a great week.
Healthy Living for Life is brought to you by Mountain Pacific Quality Health. We'd love to hear from you. If you have suggestions for future programs, visit our website at mpqhf.org or call us at 406-443-4020. You can also catch us on YouTube by visiting our website and clicking on the YouTube icon. Special thanks to Fire Tower Coffee House and Roasters. Production facilities provided by Video Express Productions.